Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Mollie. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Mollie and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about an Australian serial killer case, a serial killer couple actually, the notorious David and Catherine Burney, also known as the Moorhouse murderers. In the mid-1980s, this sadistic duo set out to abduct and kill several young women in a bid to turn their twisted sexual fantasies into a reality. They ultimately took the lives of 4 people in total, and it was only in the process of trying to claim their 5th victim when they were finally stopped and the true horror about what these evil people had done came to light. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Ana Luisa for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Ana Luisa is a sustainable jewellery brand who make the most beautiful high quality jewellery pieces. I've been buying my jewellery pretty much exclusively from Ana Luisa for years now because, like I said, they just make the most absolutely gorgeous pieces and their designs start at just $39. In fact, if you actually go back and watch my videos from the past like 6 months or so, I would say probably 95% of the time you'll see me wearing one of my Ana Luisa necklaces. Specifically this one because it is my absolute favourite. This is called the Earth Pendant and I basically never take this necklace off. I'm always wearing it, which I mean just shows you how long lasting and good quality Ana Luisa's pieces are. It's never broken on me, it's never tarnished, and it's still in the same perfect condition as it was when I first got it earlier this year. And of course, I don't need an excuse to expand my Ana Luisa collection, so I also recently treated myself to some new pieces. I got this beautiful heart pendant, which I can't lie, has definitely become one of my new favourite pieces. How stunning is it? And I also got some jewellery from their silver collection too, which is unlike me actually. I'm normally a gold jewellery kind of gal, but I saw these and I was just like, I must have. So I got this, again, heart pendant. This is called the Sunny necklace. And I also got these little dainty silver hoops. These are called the Elise earrings and I love them. Ana Luisa offers international shipping. They actually offer free shipping and free returns to those of you who live in the US. All of their products are backed by a 2-year warranty and they are carbon neutral and climate neutral certified. So if you fancy treating yourself to some beautiful jewellery from Ana Luisa or treating someone else, Christmas is obviously fast approaching, so maybe you could get someone in your life something from Ana Luisa as a present. Then now is the time to do it, my friends, because you can receive 20% off of your order when you click the link at the top line of my description box and use the discount code Mollie20. I promise you will not be disappointed. Ana Luisa are amazing. Thank you so much once again to Ana Luisa for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to all of you watching for always showing your support to the sponsors on this channel, and now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murders of several young women and it involves heavy themes such as violence towards women, rape, sexual assault, torture, incest, domestic abuse, child abuse and neglect, and suicide. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back about 37 years now to late 1986 in a suburb called Willagee, which is located in the city of Perth in Western Australia. Although actually, to begin today's case, we are going to go back even further than that. We're going to go back to the 50s because that is when both David and Catherine Burney were born. David John Burney was born on the 16th of February 1951 in an area called Wattle Grove in Perth. His parents were called John and Margaret Burney, and David was one of 5 children, the oldest of 5 children, and David and his siblings' childhoods were honestly just incredibly unpleasant. The Burneys were described as just being a very dysfunctional family because David's parents were abusive towards their children. In particular, their mother Margaret was very, very abusive. I think Margaret was the main carer, I suppose, of the children because David's father John worked 2 jobs to bring in money for the family. So he was often out of the house, although describing Margaret as carer is a big stretch because she wasn't caring towards her children at all. Margaret was apparently an alcoholic, and she would never really bathe her kids or give them a wash. She would never tidy the house. It was just kept very unkempt and dirty all the time. She would barely even feed her children. She would never cook them any kind of meal, so they often went hungry. I mean, to be honest, David was more of a parent to his younger siblings than his mother or father were, because Margaret would make the older siblings look after the younger ones so that she didn't have to do it. The only time it seemed as though she would ever really pay her kids any attention was when it was to punish them. If they ever did something wrong, she would become violent. Apparently, on one occasion, one of David's little brothers, his name was Jamie, he accidentally broke something, an object in the house, and his punishment for this, for accidentally breaking something, was to be beaten with a broomstick by his mother. The kids must have just been absolutely terrified of their mother, and it doesn't really seem as though their father John ever stepped in and tried to stop his wife's abuse towards their children. I mean, he probably wasn't there to witness a lot of it because he worked long hours, but I fail to believe that he wouldn't have known that it was happening. Perhaps he himself was scared of his wife, and so he never felt as though he could step in, who knows. In the early 1960s, so when David would have been around 10 years old, he and his family moved to another area in Perth, and as you would expect, the Burney children were, I think, in and out of the care system due to the awful conditions that they were living in at home with their parents. And it soon became clear through David's behaviour as a child that his horrific home life had scarred him and left him with a lot of anger issues. He attended a Sunday school throughout much of his childhood, and one of the Sunday school teachers described how quickly David Burney could lose his temper, even as a kid, and how he would often draw very violent drawings. And when he entered his early teenage years, his violent side just emerged even more, and he started committing crimes at a very young age. Sources state that when David was around 14 years old, his mother and father decided to get a divorce. However, they made it very clear that neither of them wanted to take David with them. Neither of them wanted to have custody of their eldest son, and so perhaps this is what led to David starting to lash out and break the law. Like I said, as a young teenager, he began what would be a life of crime. He started committing, I suppose, more low-level crimes like petty theft and burglaries, and he was arrested and sent to juvenile detention facilities, I believe a couple of times, but it was when he was 15 years old that his crime spree took an even darker turn, because that was when David Burney attempted to rape someone. By this point, he was working in a horse stables. He had quit school and he had gotten himself a job working in these stables. Apparently his goal was to become an apprentice jockey. However, whilst he was there, sources state that he was abusive towards the horses, he would be violent towards them, and one night he broke into the home of his landlady. This job provided him with housing, and he broke into his landlady's house and just exposed himself to her and attempted to rape her. But thankfully, her dog was actually in the room with her at the time, and the dog, I think, got very aggressive when David launched the attack, and it actually scared David away. And of course, following this, David Burney was immediately fired. But it was around this same time, I think in his mid-teenage years, when David Burney reconnected with an old friend of his. Her name was Catherine Harrison. David and Catherine met in the early 1960s when they were both still very young. I believe they were around like 11, 12 years old. They met through mutual friends and they became good friends themselves. But it wasn't until a couple of years later when this friendship seemed to turn into something more. They became partners, both romantically, but also partners in crime. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit more about Catherine and her upbringing. So Catherine Harrison Harrison was born on the 23rd of May 1951, so she was only a couple of months younger than David, and her parents were called Harold and Doreen Harrison. But tragically, Catherine's mother wouldn't be in her life for very long, as before Catherine even really reached the age of a toddler, Doreen passed away in childbirth as she was giving birth to Catherine's little brother, and he sadly passed away too. And following Doreen's passing, Catherine's father actually sent his daughter to go and live with his parents, her grandparents, as he didn't feel as though he could raise her on his own. I think she lived with her dad for a little while. He actually lived in South Africa, so she lived there with him for a short period of time before sending her to live with grandparents who allegedly were quite neglectful of Catherine. To be honest, Catherine was moved a lot as a child. She was often passed from relative to relative. It seems as though no one really wanted her for very long. One minute her father would want her to live with him, and then he would change his mind and she would be sent elsewhere. So she never really had any stability in her life as a child. At age 10, she began living with her father once again. He was given full custody of his daughter, and it's thought that this kind of unstable home environment that Catherine had grown up in made it difficult for her to make and maintain friendships at school. None of the other kids really wanted to be friends with Catherine Harrison or play with her. I think she was seen as the weird kid or something because of the fact that she moved around a lot. I can imagine that this could have had a big impact on her social skills, always being so unsettled. But as we know, she did eventually make one friend. She found friendship with David Burney, and in their mid-teenage years this friendship developed into more of a romance, and it's been reported that they began a sexual relationship when they were only about 14 years old. By this point, David Burney had obviously already committed several petty crimes, and it seemed as though this rebellious nature of his soon rubbed off on Catherine as they started committing crimes together. They started committing robberies, burglaries, they were stealing cars, they were breaking into people's houses and businesses. They really spurred each other on. Breaking the law became almost like a hobby for them. It was exciting. Catherine's father Harold apparently begged his daughter at one point to please split up with David Burney, because I suppose in his eyes it was all David's fault that Catherine had gone down this path. If it wasn't for him, she would have never gotten involved in crime. However, Catherine refused to leave David. I mean, naturally, when you tell a teenager not to do something, it just makes them want to do it even more and go against you even more. So she stayed with David and the crime spree continued. But they weren't caught for their crimes. They didn't get away with it. They were constantly in trouble with the authorities, and David was sent off to prison for a period of time, whereas at first Catherine was just put on probation. It's believed that the courts were a bit more lenient with her because she was young and naive and probably was easily influenced by David. So yeah, she only received probation. However, as soon as David got out of prison, they reconnected again and the crimes just continued. However, this time when they were caught, the court system were not so easy on Catherine, and she received a prison sentence, as did David. He was also sent back to prison. And according to sources, Catherine actually became a mother while she was behind bars. Before she was locked up, she had gotten herself pregnant, I believe with another man, not with David. And when she gave birth in jail, the baby was, of course, immediately taken away and I think put into the care system. And it appears as though prison did change Catherine Burney for the better, momentarily at least. She apparently spoke a lot with a counsellor while she was inside, and with their help, she was able to, I guess, separate herself from David Burney. They helped her to see the light, I suppose, helped her to realise that David was a bad influence, and so she cut ties with him. Catherine spent, I believe, only about 6 months in prison in total, and upon her release, alongside her parole officer, she was able to secure a job working as a housekeeper for a family called the McLaughlin family, and that is when she met the man who she would eventually go on to marry. His name was Donald McLaughlin, and he was the son of the people people who had employed her as the housekeeper. They started seeing each other, they seemed to really hit it off, and eventually when Catherine turned 21 years old, they married. They actually got married on her 21st birthday, and they started a family. They had a number of children together. Some sources say that they had 6 children, others say 7, but tragically their first child, it was a little boy, he actually died when he was still very young, still just a baby. He died in a car crash. He was hit by a car, and this actually happened right in front of Catherine. She witnessed her son's horrific death, and it has been theorized by experts that the trauma that this left Catherine with may have contributed to what she would go on to do later in life. It changed something in her brain, and as I said, may have contributed to the evil person that she ultimately became. But as I said, she went on to have several more kids with Donald, and it would appear as though the two of them went on to live a relatively normal, happy life for a number of years, as did David Birney. After he was released from prison for the burglaries and robberies and everything, he eventually got married too. He married a woman named Kerry, also when he was around 21 years old, and they had a daughter together. And just like Donald and Catherine, David and Kerry appeared to also have a very happy marriage. They were a happy little family of 3, or at least that was until David suffered a head injury whilst at work. At the time, he was working on a dredging barge. Dredging is the process of excavating materials under the water and bringing them up to the surface. And on one occasion, there was an incident where I think something heavy was accidentally dropped on David's head whilst he was working. And his wife Kerry said that this left him with quite a big gash on his head. This wound would, of course, eventually heal, but Kerry said that after suffering this head injury, her husband was never the same. He healed physically, but it was like mentally something changed in David Birney, and over time Kerry noticed that his whole temperament was just completely different. He would be very nitpicky with Kerry all of a sudden and very critical of the things that she did or how she did them, and he also became unfaithful to Kerry. He started having affairs with multiple different women. He even started advertising for sexual partners in the local newspapers, which Kerry said was very out of character for him. He never did anything like that before the head injury. So Kerry put up with it for a long time. She stayed with him despite the abuse and despite the affairs. However, the final straw came for Kerry when she found out that one of the women that David started cheating on her with, wow, she wasn't a woman at all. She was a teenage girl. She was just 16 years old and he was a grown man. Some sources say that this girl was actually their daughter's babysitter, and David even tried to move her into his home, the home where he lived with his wife and daughter. And so Kerry took their child and she herself left. She left David for good. She divorced him and started a new life with just her and their daughter. But David's relationship with this 16-year-old girl wouldn't last, because in the mid-80s, another woman caught his attention, an old flame from the past. It was Catherine Harrison, or Catherine McLaughlin, as she would have been called by this point, because obviously she was married to Donald. In the mid-80s, after, I believe, over a decade of not seeing each other, David and Catherine reconnected again, and this reconnection would ultimately have the most devastating consequences. According to one source, how this all came about was that after the birth of her last child with Donald, they both decided that they didn't want any more kids, and so Catherine decided that she was going to have a hysterectomy. And apparently David Birney somehow, and it's not known how, maybe it was through Catherine herself, but somehow he found out about this. He found out that Catherine was having this surgery, and so he began visiting her while she was recovering in hospital. And despite how long it had been since they had seen each other last, it was almost like nothing nothing had changed when they came together again. All of those feelings that Catherine had for David came rushing back, and vice versa, I suppose. And so in 1985, when she and David were around their mid-30s, Catherine decided to leave her husband of like 13 years to be with her childhood sweetheart, David Burney. Apparently, Catherine was really quite unhappy in her marriage by this time anyway, so it was an easy decision for her to leave Donald. And she also just left her children. She just walked out on Donald and their kids. Apparently, she didn't even tell her family that she was leaving to be with David. She didn't tell her husband that she was leaving him. So when she went out and didn't return home one day, Donald actually called the police because he was so concerned about her. He thought that his wife was missing. So the police followed up on this report. They checked on Catherine, and they were the ones who had to deliver the news to Donald that no, she's fine, she just doesn't want to be with you anymore. She's left you for another man. Now, I don't know what Catherine's contact was like with her kids following her and Donald's separation. Articles seem to imply that she didn't really have much contact with them at all. She really did leave both Donald and her kids, but take that with a pinch of salt because I really don't know if she still played an active role in her children's lives or not following this. But anyway, David and Catherine were together once again. They quickly moved in together and they started living in a property on Moorhouse Street in Willagee. Their address was 3 Moorhouse Street, Willagee, an address that would later become infamous because of the absolutely horrific crimes that David and Catherine would commit there. Catherine actually decided to change her name after she and David got together. They didn't get legally married, but she changed her last name anyway to Burney. She became Catherine Burney. And it was around this time when they started experimenting with sadomasochistic sex, which David had always had an interest in. He got the most sexual sexual gratification when he could be aggressive and inflict pain upon the person that he was having sex with. He was described as being a sex addict, essentially. Sources state that he had to have sex at least 6 times a day or else he would lose it. He would become angry and restless. In fact, on one occasion during a period when David was single and he obviously wasn't getting enough sex as he apparently needed, he actually raped one of his younger brothers, Jamie. He apparently spent days pleading with his brother, his sibling, to sleep with him because he hadn't had sex in days, and he said that he was going out of his mind because of it. And of course, Jamie kept saying, no, absolutely not. And so David just decided to rape him one night. I mean, can you even imagine the trauma that this must have left Jamie with? Being assaulted in that way by his big brother, someone who is supposed to protect him. Although, much like his older brother, Jamie also eventually went on to become a sex offender himself. He went to prison for the rape of an elderly woman and for molesting a young girl, a child. And it was whilst he was in prison that he confided in his parole officer about the time when his big brother sexually assaulted him. I really just don't understand how on earth he could have gone through something as traumatic as he did and still decide to do it to someone else, knowing the pain that an ordeal like that can cause you and still decide to inflict that pain on another person. It's insane. In addition to that, when Jamie turned 21, by this time David and Catherine were together, and their present to Jamie on his birthday was Catherine. David was going to allow his brother to have sex with Catherine just on this one occasion as a birthday gift. And apparently, as it was happening, David watched. He watched the whole thing and it gave him sexual arousal. Seeing his partner and his brother have sex turned him on. And the insatiable appetite that David had for very violent sex, for sadomasochism, never went away. If anything, it grew more intense and became even darker. In fact, he would share with Catherine his very, very violent sexual fantasies, how he fantasized about tying women up and gagging them, assaulting them, strangling them, even killing them. And this confession from David didn't appear to upset or shock or disgust Catherine. Instead, she seemed to have the opposite reaction. She basically said to David, let's do it. Let's turn your sexual fantasies into a reality to feed this sexual appetite of yours. Let's look for young women that we can kidnap and kill together. And that's exactly what they did. Catherine would later confess that before they started their killing spree, she and David read a book together. It was called The Perfect Murder. And this book was something that inspired them even more. It acted as like a guide almost for what they were about to do. And in October of 1986, David and Catherine Burney's murder spree began. Their first victim was a 22-year-old woman named Mary Nielsen. She was a uni student. She attended the University of Western Australia, where she studied psychology, and alongside this she also had a part-time job working at a delicatessen. And it was in early October of 1986 when Mary unfortunately came into contact with David Burney. Now by this point David was working in a car yard, a spare parts yard in Perth, and one day Mary went to this yard because she needed some new tyres for her car. And when she started chatting to one of the workers, David, he told Mary that he had some spare tyres that she could have, but he said that she would have to pick them up from his home. So he took Mary's phone number, and it was actually Catherine who would ultimately contact Mary and give her their address and arrange a date and a time for Mary to come over. And when the time came, Mary knocked on the door of 3 Moorhouse Street, and she was let inside by David and Catherine, completely unaware of the danger that she had just walked into. Of course, David had lied. He wasn't going to give Mary any tyres. His intentions were far, far more sinister. And as soon as Mary entered that house, she was immediately attacked by David and Catherine. They threatened her with a knife, they gagged her, and then they tied her to a bed in the house. And it was following this when David raped Mary, whilst Catherine just stood and watched. Well, she didn't just watch, actually. Catherine would apparently encourage David to keep going and spur him on whilst he was committing the rape. She clearly enjoyed watching him do this, watching him violate a young woman. After he raped Mary, David decided that they needed to get rid of her car, which was parked outside of their house, because obviously when people realised that she was missing, if they found her car outside of the Burney's address, they're going to get caught. So whilst Catherine stayed at home and I guess guarded Mary, David drove her car away. He actually drove it to outside a police station in Perth, of all places, and once he returned home, the assault on Mary continued. David raped her again, and then I believe it was later that same day, that night, when the couple took Mary elsewhere. They untied her from the bed and forced Mary into their car, and they drove with her to the Gleneagle National Park in Western Australia, which was planned by the couple beforehand. They had researched and come up with ideas on where they could take their victims and ultimately dispose of their bodies. So this was all premeditated. The plan was to always bring Mary here. Once they arrived, they dragged Mary out of the car. David raped her once again, and then she was killed. They placed a nylon cord around her neck and strangled her. And in addition to this, she was also stabbed in the heart. According to sources, she was stabbed by David after she was already dead, so it was the strangulation that killed her. But apparently he had read in a book somewhere that if you stab someone in the heart, they decompose quicker or something. So she was stabbed, and following this, David and Catherine buried her in a shallow grave. And then I think they just went home. They probably reflected on what they had just done and revelled in it. They weren't feeling remorse or guilt for having taken the life of an innocent young girl. They were feeling pleasure and excitement, so much so that they decided to do it again. And less than 2 weeks later, they found their second victim. It was the evening of the 20th of October 1986 when David and Catherine Burney were driving around. They were driving along the streets in Claremont in Perth, which is less than a 20-minute drive away from Willagee. And as they were driving along the Stirling Highway, they came across a young girl whom they decided would be be their next victim. It was actually Catherine who decided this. The couple had agreed that Catherine would decide whether or not they would abduct and kill a certain girl, which I believe is why Catherine was the one who made the phone call to Mary Nielsen about collecting the tyres. She had to kind of scope Mary out first and decide whether or not she would be an ideal victim, I suppose, and obviously she did think so. So yeah, they were driving around that night looking along the streets, and that was when Catherine spotted a teenage girl named Susanna Candy. Susanna was only around 15 to 16 years old at the time. She lived in an area called Nedlands in Perth. She lived with her parents and her siblings. She was still in high school, and she just seemed like a very normal, happy teenage girl. That night, Susanna was hitchhiking along the Stirling Highway after finishing work. She was walking home from her part-time job when David and Catherine Burney pulled up alongside her in their car, and Catherine asked Susanna if she wanted a ride. They didn't mind giving her a lift somewhere, and Susanna said yes please. Susanna obviously didn't think anything of it, getting into a car with two strangers, especially when one of them was a woman. Maybe if it was just David in the car, Susanna would have been a bit more hesitant to accept this offer, but because Catherine was there, she probably felt more at ease, because when you think of dangerous sexual predators, who do you picture? Men usually, rarely women. So Susanna probably would have thought that it was safe to get in this couple's car, but unfortunately she was so very wrong. As soon as Susanna was inside of the vehicle, David began driving away, and Catherine jumped into the back seat next to Susanna, and she threatened her at knife point. She tied her hands together, and she was then taken straight back to their home on Moorhouse Street, where she was subjected to much of the same abuse as the previous victim. Susanna was tied to the bed, she was gagged, raped, and heartbreakingly during her captivity, the Burneys forced Susanna to write a letter to her family saying that she was okay and that she had decided to just take a last-minute trip to Queensland with some friends of hers, and then this letter was later posted. But according to a documentary that I watched about this case, they didn't just force her to write a letter. The next day, they forced her to literally ring her parents whilst they held a knife to her throat, and again say the same thing, that she was fine and that she was going away with friends so she wouldn't be home for a while. My heart breaks for Susanna, honestly. She probably knew full well why they were making her do this, write the letters and make the phone call, because David and Catherine were obviously hoping that it would stop her family from looking for her and reporting her as missing to the police. It would stop them from thinking that anything sinister had happened to their daughter, and therefore stop them from raising any kind of alarm. Susanna was repeatedly raped by the couple while she was held hostage, until eventually they decided that it was time to kill her too, and they attempted to do so by, again, using nylon cord to strangle her to death. However, despite the fact that there were two of them, they were really struggling to do this because Susanna was fighting back as much as she possibly could. She really put up a fight for her life, so they couldn't get her still to be able to strangle her, and so they decided to drug her. They forced her to consume several sleeping tablets, and once she was very drowsy and basically asleep, it was Catherine who used the cord to strangle her to death, whilst David sat back and watched. And when Catherine was later asked why she did it, why she strangled Susanna Candy, she said the following: "Because I wanted to see how strong I was within my inner self. I didn't feel a thing. It was like I expected. I was prepared to follow him to the end of the earth and do anything to see that his desires were satisfied. She was a female. Females hurt and destroy males." After Susanna was dead, the couple put her body in their car and they drove her to the Gleneagle forest, and she was buried in a spot close to where their first victim, Mary Nielsen, was buried. Their third victim would be abducted just 10 days after Susanna Candy on the 1st of November 1986, and her name was Nolene Patterson. Nolene was 31 years old, and sources state that she used to work as an air hostess, a flight attendant, although apparently at the time that this case occurred, she was working as a bar manager, and she was described as being a very elegant and charming young woman. And on that fateful day, the 1st of November, Nolene was driving along the Canning Highway in Perth after having just left work, when suddenly she realised that she was out of gas, and so she had to pull over. And that was when she was spotted by David and Catherine Burney, who were out that night driving around once again searching for a potential victim. As I mentioned before, it was Catherine who would choose which girls or women they could kidnap, and she and David actually had this secret code between them. If Catherine saw a woman that she thought could be a potential victim, she would say to David, quote, "I've got the munchies," and if he agreed, he would say, "So have I." And that was their signal between them. When Catherine pointed out a woman and she started talking about having the munchies to David, he knew that that meant they were going to try and kidnap the woman that Catherine had seen. After spotting Nolene Patterson standing by the side of her vehicle on the Canning Highway, David and Catherine Burney pulled up alongside her and they offered her a lift. And obviously Nolene was in quite a desperate situation. She was basically stranded on the highway, and so she gladly accepted. But of course, once she was inside the car, she was immediately attacked and threatened with a knife, and she was taken back to the couple's home where she was essentially kept as their prisoner. She was tied to the bed, gagged, sexually assaulted. Just like Susanna Candy, she was forced to make a phone call to her loved one saying that she was okay, she was safe, and that she was just staying with some friends, and obviously the couple planned to eventually murder her too. However, surprisingly for David Burney, there was something different about Nolene Patterson. She was different to the previous victims. He actually grew to like her. You see, Nolene went into pure survival mode pretty much as soon as she was abducted, and she thought that the only way that she might be able to get out of this and escape with her life is if she tried to befriend the couple, befriend David in particular. If she tried not to act scared and she began talking to David like a friend, maybe he would see her as one too, and he would spare her life and eventually let her go. And it was working. As I said, David grew to like Nolene. In fact, it's believed that he probably developed some sort of romantic feelings for her, which of course Catherine really did not like. She was furious because she could see that David was treating Nolene completely different from how he had treated their previous victims. So it was clear that he liked her, which enraged Catherine. It filled her with such jealousy. So this sparked a huge row between David and Catherine, during which Catherine grabbed a knife from the kitchen and she told David that he had a choice to make. Either Catherine was going to use this knife to kill Nolene, or she was going to use it to kill herself. And David had to choose. He had to choose which one of them was going to die. And ultimately, David chose Nolene. He chose Nolene to die. And the two of them forced Nolene to consume a load of sleeping pills. And once she was asleep, they strangled her to death. She was killed about 3 days after she was first abducted. She was kept alive and held prisoner for 3 days before her death. Following her death, her body was driven to the Gleneagle forest where she was buried. However, she wasn't buried too close to where Mary Nielsen and Susanna Candy were buried. David wanted Nolene to be buried away from them because, again, he thought that she was different. He liked her, and so in his eyes, she deserved to have her own kind of spot, her own burial place. And unlike Mary and Susanna, David also decided to leave Nolene's underwear on when burying her, because to him, she deserved what he felt was the respect of having her underwear still on, whereas the other two victims didn't in his eyes. Of course, Catherine despised Nolene because of David's feelings for her, and so she apparently very much enjoyed throwing sand in Nolene's face when they put her in the shallow grave and began to cover her over. So now their victim count was 3. They had killed 3 innocent young women, and shortly after Nolene was abducted, the victim count raised to 4. Just 4 days after Nolene was kidnapped, and I believe just the day after she was killed on the 5th of November 1986, the Burneys abducted a 21-year-old woman from a bus stop. You can really see here how much their confidence was growing. These murders were happening in very, very quick succession. In the beginning, the killings were almost a couple of weeks apart from one another, and now they were days apart, or well, a matter of hours apart really, between Nolene's murder and the abduction of their 4th victim. On the evening of the 5th of November 1986, David and Catherine Burney were doing their usual routine of driving along the streets in search for a woman that they could kill. And that was when they noticed 21-year-old Denise Brown. Denise worked as a computer operator. She was in a relationship, she had a boyfriend, and they had moved in together. All in all, she seemed to have a very good life, an exciting future ahead of her. That was until it was cruelly snatched away. On this particular day, the 5th of November, Denise had been hanging out with a friend of hers, and when she left and she said goodbye to this friend, she headed to a bus stop on Sterling Highway. So I think she planned to get the bus home until a better offer seemed to come along, when a man and a woman pulled up next to her in their car and they offered her a lift. It was obviously David and Catherine Burney. Denise accepted this kind offer from these strangers and she got into the car, but once inside, she was immediately threatened and she was taken back to David and Catherine's home on Moorhouse Street, where she endured a horrific ordeal just like the victims before her. She was stripped naked, her clothing and her jewellery were taken from her, she was tied up, raped. She too was made to make a phone call to a friend of hers claiming that she had decided to go away for a few days so as to not arouse any suspicion, and the day after she was abducted she was taken to a forest, but not the Glen Eagle forest where the previous victims had been taken. Denise was taken to Wanneroo in Perth, the Wanneroo pine plantation, and it was there where Denise Brown was once again sexually assaulted by the couple. Apparently David Burney raped her in the car whilst they waited in the forest for it to get dark outside, and then once the sun went down, Denise was forced out of the vehicle to an area in the forest where she was sexually assaulted once more. And then following this, David Burney pulled out a knife and he stabbed Denise in the neck with it. He attempted to slit her throat. Thinking that Denise was now dead, David and Catherine Burney began to bury her in a shallow grave. However, to their shock, whilst they were literally burying her, Denise suddenly sat up in her grave. She wasn't dead. Unbelievably, the stab wound to her neck hadn't killed her. And so David quickly ran to the car, he opened the trunk and he grabbed an axe that he had kept in there. He ran back to Denise and using this axe, he began beating her around the head with it. And finally, she died. And then they obviously carried on with burying her. And again, just days later, this serial killing couple decided that it was time to kill again. However, unbeknownst to David and Catherine, this time they would actually be unsuccessful, and as it would turn out, their 5th victim would ultimately result in their downfall. It was the 9th of November 1986, about a month after the abduction and murder of their first victim, Mary Nielsen, when a 17-year-old girl named Kate Moore was picked up by David and Catherine Burney as she was hitchhiking along the Sterling Highway. Kate had apparently been out with friends that evening, and afterwards she started walking along the highway, and that was when she was kidnapped by David and Catherine, and she was held at knife point in their car. She was taken back to their address where she was, of course, assaulted, tied up, forced to ring her family. Apparently, David held a knife to her throat whilst Kate rang her mother and told her that she was going to stay with friends for a few days. Kate said that whilst being held captive, she was made to do things like dance for the couple. I think they made her dance naked. She would be forced to sleep in their bed with them, and while she slept, she would be handcuffed handcuffed to David so that she couldn't get away. The fear that Kate must have felt during her captivity is just beyond comprehension, but she was very, very clever. She obviously recognized the danger that she was in, and she knew that the chances of her making it out of this alive were slim, that there was a high chance that David and Catherine would murder her, and so she decided to try and hide like little notes and objects of hers around the Barneys' house so that if the worst happened, if she was tragically killed, hopefully her killers wouldn't get away with it because police would find evidence in their home which connected them to Kate. So for example, she hid her lipstick underneath the couch cushions. She hid a packet of cigarettes that she had on her in a little hole in the ceiling. She also had her friend's driving license on her, so she hid that in the house. She scribbled some notes on little bits of paper. She would write down her name and her phone number and hide these all over the house when David and Catherine weren't looking. According to a couple of sources, she left a load of sleeping pills which would have had her DNA on underneath the mattress because on the evening that she was kidnapped, the couple tried to force her to consume several sleeping tablets, but Kate just pretended to. She pretended that she had swallowed them, but she hadn't. And when David and Catherine had fallen asleep next to her, she spat these pills out and she placed them underneath the mattress so that hopefully they would later be found. Like I said, she was very, very clever. She was doing everything that she could think of to leave her mark so that, again, heaven forbid she did die at the hands of David and Catherine, they wouldn't be able to get away with it. But in addition to all of that, Kate also attempted the same survival tactic as David and Catherine's third victim, Nolene Patterson. But unlike Nolene, how she tried to befriend David, Kate actually tried to befriend Catherine. She would try to engage in conversation with Catherine and ask her about her hobbies and interests, what kind of music she liked, just anything that she could think of to try and slowly gain Catherine's trust. And it actually worked. In fact, the day following her abduction, when David went off to work, she actually managed to convince Catherine to untie her. And just a couple of hours after this, Kate saw an opportunity to try and escape when she and Catherine heard a knock at the door. Catherine was expecting this knock. It was actually someone who was dropping off some drugs for her and David, and so when she heard it, she put Kate in the bedroom and told her to stay there while she went to answer the door. However, she neglected to tie Kate back up before she left, and as soon as Kate was left alone, she was just like, this is it. This may be the only chance that I have to escape. I have to take it. And so as Catherine went to answer the front door, Kate ran to the window in the bedroom. She managed to unlock it and she jumped out. And apparently when she landed on the ground outside, she banged her head on the concrete. But clearly momentum just kept her going because despite this injury and despite the fact that she was practically naked, she just started running as fast as she could away from the house. She started just banging on neighbors' doors, trying to get anyone's attention that she could, trying to find help, until eventually she ran into a local shop and she started crying and screaming, telling the people in there what she had just endured, and obviously the police were called. And according to a couple of sources, unbelievably, when the police picked Kate up and they took her back to the police station and took her statement, the majority of the police officers just didn't believe her, despite the state that she was in and the fact that she had literally ran into a shop naked. They accused her of lying and just making this whole story of abduction and rape up for attention, which literally makes me so angry. I think it's disgraceful that their initial reaction when hearing Kate tell her story was to accuse her of being a liar. Absolutely vile. They were so convinced that she was lying, in fact, that they were going to punish her. They were going to write her up for making a false report without even investigating her claims. The officers handed this report over to a young female police officer to deal with, Officer Laura Hancock, who I believe was actually very new to the police force. She herself was only 22 years old. And as Officer Hancock was speaking to Kate and taking her statement, she just knew that this girl was not lying. She was telling the truth. She could just tell from how Kate was telling her story and how many details she was able to provide that this really did happen. Kate was even able to tell Officer Hancock the name of one of her kidnappers. She said that during her captivity, her kidnappers would constantly use fake names when around her. However, at one point, Kate spotted a pill bottle in the home, a medicine bottle, and the name on this bottle was David Burney. And it was when Officer Hancock passed on this name to the other officers, the officers who didn't believe Kate at first, that was when they actually started to take her account seriously and consider that actually maybe this young girl isn't lying after all, because David Burney was a name that the officers had heard before. Obviously, he'd been involved with the law several times over the years for various different crimes. He had an extensive criminal record, and they knew that one crime he had been accused of was attempted rape. The attempted rape of that landlady from when he worked at the stables at just 15 years old. Only upon hearing the name David Burney did these officers actually start to listen to Kate, and she told them, and Officer Hancock, everything about her ordeal, everything that she knew about the couple who had kidnapped her. And she also told them about how she had left as many notes and items hidden in their house as she possibly could to leave traces of her behind. So following this, Kate got into a car with police officers and she directed them to the address where she was held hostage, 3 Moorhouse Street, Willagee, which sure enough was where David Burney lived. And as soon as Kate saw the house, she just started getting very upset, very panicked. She was crying, understandably. It must have been so incredibly traumatic for her to be taken back to that house. So officers got out of their vehicle, they knocked on the front door, and as I understand it, no one was home at the time, but I believe the front door was actually unlocked. So the officers went inside and they started looking around the property, and as they did so, they found a load of the evidence that Kate said she had left behind. They found the notes, the driving license, the lipstick, the sleeping pills. Every item she said she had left was found in the exact places where she told the police she had left them, which was proof that her story was absolutely true. She really had been abducted and essentially tortured by the couple who lived here, David and Catherine Burney. But as I said, neither of them were home at the time that the police arrived there, and so they decided to just wait outside. They waited in their car for the couple to return home, and it was Catherine who returned home first. And as soon as the officers saw Catherine, they approached her and she was immediately arrested. As was David, he was also arrested, and they were both taken to the police station where they were interviewed separately. And I believe they both initially denied it. Well, apparently Catherine denied everything. She denied doing anything to Kate Moore. She said that she'd never even seen Kate before, whereas sources state that David said that they did know Kate because she had come to their house willingly to have a threesome with him and his partner Catherine, but he said that it was completely consensual. So already the police know that these two are lying because they don't even have the same story. Catherine was denying that they'd ever even met Kate, and David was saying that they had met her, but that they'd had consensual sex with her. He said that they didn't abduct or rape her, as Kate was claiming. So of course the detectives knew that neither of them were being truthful, and so the questioning continued. They kept grilling David and Catherine and pressuring them to confess and just be honest. And surprisingly, eventually David did. He finally admitted that, okay, yes, they'd had kidnapped and held Kate Moore captive in their home and they had raped her. But that wasn't all that David Burney confessed to. To the detectives' absolute shock and horror, he also confessed to having raped and murdered several more women, 4 women to be exact. He actually made a comment in his interview which was something along the lines of, it's getting late, it's getting dark outside, so grab a shovel and I'll show you where they are. He told the detectives that he would take them to where he and Catherine had buried their victims. And again, shockingly, when Catherine was told that David had confessed, she also decided to drop the act. She probably thought, well, there's no point in me denying it now if he's admitted everything, and so she too confessed to the murders, and she also agreed to accompany the police to the gravesite. They directed the detectives to the pine plantation in Wanneroo where Denise Brown was buried, and the Gleneagle National Forest where Nolene Patterson, Susanna Candy and Mary Nielsen were buried. And eventually all 4 victims' bodies were recovered from the ground. And just as a side note, apparently when Catherine Burney showed the detectives the exact location in the Gleneagle Forest where Nolene Patterson was, she actually spat on Nolene's grave. Right in front of the detective, she just spat on the place where Nolene was buried because, as we know, she hated Nolene. She despised her because of the feelings that David developed for Nolene during the time that she was held hostage by them. So that just shows that Catherine Burney had absolutely no remorse whatsoever for what she and David had done, for her part in these horrific killings. She had admitted to her part, but she didn't feel bad about it. She didn't feel any kind of guilt whatsoever. Following the recovery of the victims, as you can imagine, news of these horrific murders spread very, very quickly around Australia. And of course, the public were absolutely stunned and sickened by this sadistic serial killing couple. They were calling for their executions. They wanted David and Catherine Burney to be put to death for what they did.
If I was inside there, I'll kill you.
Both David and Catherine were eventually charged with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of abduction and rape. And in February of 1987, David Burney pleaded guilty to all of his charges, which meant that he didn't have to go to trial. And apparently, when he was asked in court his reason why he decided to plead guilty, he pointed to the families of the victims and said, quote, "It's the least I could do." As for Catherine, she actually didn't enter a plea for a while because it was decided that she would undergo a psychiatric test first to determine whether she was actually mentally stable enough to stand trial. And ultimately it was concluded that she was fit to stand trial. And I believe she too entered a plea of guilty. And following this, both she and David were sentenced to 4 terms of life imprisonment with the requirement that they would have to serve at least 20 years before they were even considered for parole. But of course the judge said that it was extremely unlikely that they would ever be released due to the brutality of their crimes. And with that, they were both sent off to prison. Apparently, David in particular was attacked a number of times in prison by his fellow inmates, so much so that he did have to be moved to solitary confinement for a period of time. And then in October of 2005, so just under 2 decades after his and Catherine's killing spree, David Burney passed away at the age of 54. He was found dead in his cell at the Casuarina prison in Western Australia, and his cause of death was suicide. He had killed himself. As for Catherine Burney, she is still alive to this day. Today she is about 72 years old. She's incarcerated at the Bandiup Women's Prison in Western Australia, and she's obviously been behind bars for what, like 36 years now. And what is really, really sickening is that during her time behind bars, Catherine actually contacted a couple of other infamous female serial killers from all over the world. She would converse with them via letters. For example, at one point she was in contact with Eileen Wuornos, an American serial killer responsible for the deaths of 7 people, 7 men, and she was also corresponding with British serial killer Myra Hindley, who alongside her partner Ian Brady was responsible for the murders of 5 children, which honestly completely shocked me when I read that. I can't believe that that was even allowed, that she was allowed to write letters to these other female killers. She obviously did it because to her, they were her people. They were people that she could relate to. Of course, naturally, when news spread of David and Catherine Burney's killing spree, they were likened to that of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. A lot of people recognised the similarities between them because they were both partners who committed their murders together. They were always in it together. And they were also later compared to the likes of Fred and Rose West too, obviously another serial killing couple. But yeah, as I was saying, I personally think it's so twisted, to be honest, that Catherine Burney was allowed to converse and send letters to other female killers, particularly Myra Hindley. I don't actually know if Myra Hindley would write back, but if she did, I would just be fascinated to find out what the hell they would even talk about in these letters, what they said to each other. But aside from that, it appears as though Catherine, for the most part, has been a pretty model prisoner over the years. She's taken part in plays that the prison has put on. She actually runs the prison library. She's the librarian. She has tried to apply for parole several times over the years. Obviously, she first became eligible for parole in 2007 after she had served 20 years behind bars, but she was rejected, and as I said, she has applied a couple more times since then, but every single time she has been denied. As I mentioned before, it is highly unlikely that she will ever be granted parole, and likely that she will die behind bars, which is no less than she deserves, to be honest. In fact, apparently, even one of Catherine's children, one of her sons, has come forward in recent years and said that even he believes that his mother should never be released from prison for what she did. In fact, he's even said that he thinks she deserves death. She deserves to be executed for her and David Burney's horrific crimes. And actually, a major part in why Catherine Burney has always been denied parole is thanks to her and David's final victim, Kate Moore, the 17-year-old girl who survived and escaped and essentially put an end to their murder spree because she immediately went to the police. Because when Catherine's minimum 20-year sentence came to an end in 2007, due to the laws in Western Australia at the time, she was able to apply for parole every 3 years, and at every single one of Catherine's parole hearings, Kate would have to attend and tell her story to the court and relive the trauma that she went through, and essentially plead with the courts not to release Catherine Burney because of the danger that she posed. And of course, Kate didn't think that that was fair. It wasn't fair for victims like her to have to be put through this horrific ordeal of having to attend their attackers' parole hearings every couple of years because of the trauma that resurfaces for them every single time. And so she became a victim advocate and activist, and thanks to her work in 2018, a new bill was passed by Parliament which would make it more difficult for serial killers like Catherine to even apply for parole. I believe this new law in Australia now means that people who have been convicted of 3 or more murders would be banned from applying for parole for up to 6 years now after their last attempt, rather than every 3 years, which is amazing. What an incredible woman Kate is, to use what happened to her, her experience, to try and help other victims and ensure that evil killers like Catherine Burney never see freedom again. And that concludes this case. That is the case of notorious serial killing couple David and Catherine Burney, also known as the Moorhouse murders case. Of course, naturally, it is speculated that the Burneys had even more victims than the 5 that we've discussed in this video. In particular, it's been theorised that David may have been involved in the disappearance of a woman named Lisa Marie Mott in 1980, and that both David and Catherine may have been involved in the disappearances of Cheryl Renwick and Barbara Weston. They both vanished in 1986, the same year that David and Catherine carried out their other murders. However, there has never been sufficient evidence to definitively link them to those cases, and I personally think that if they were involved in the disappearances of those 3 women, they probably would have confessed to them. I mean, it was clear that David and Catherine likely enjoyed the notoriety that their killing spree gave them. And I just think that if they did have more victims, would they not have just confessed to those murders when they confessed to the other 4? Particularly David, he admitted to the murders relatively quickly in his interview. So what reason would he have for only admitting to certain killings and not the other ones, you know? I don't know, maybe it was just a part of a game for him. He had decided that he would tell the police about some of his crimes, but not the others, so that he could still keep an element of control or something, who knows? And of course, Catherine would have just gone along with whatever David had said. But do let me know your opinions on that in the comments. Do you think that the Bunnies had more victims? But yeah, that is it for this case. As always, please do let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. You can leave case suggestions down below in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box. Before I go, I just want to say a big thank you to Anna Louisa once again for partnering with me on this video, and a quick reminder that you can receive 20% off of your order when you use the discount code Mollie20. The link to the Anna Louisa website is down below in the description. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye!